Hi, everybody. It's Pastor Tom of the 24 Today podcast. I want to thank you for joining me. Today, it's my privilege to have Sharon Wilharm with me, and we are going to talk about a tragic historical event. In fact, would easily be one of the most tragic naval events in our history in this country. But Sharon has a very special connection to this event, and Sharon's a filmmaker along with her husband and has a feature film out that has to do with this. So, Sharon, I'm going to let you tell us more about that, and welcome to the podcast, Sharon. Thanks for being on.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here today.
The name of the movie, this is your seventh feature film.
Yes.
And the name of this movie is Summer of '67, and there was a very tragic event that happened July 29th, 1967. And what was that event, Sharon?
It was a fire aboard the USS Forrestal. And my dad was on the Forrestal in the Navy. And there's so many different explanations of what happened. Nobody is in agreement of what it was, but it was basically a series of accidents that happened and caused a horrific fire. And because there were all these bombs involved, the bombs went off, and 134 men died, 161 injured. Although this past week, when we were talking with some men that were on the Forrestal, and they were saying that actually that number is closer to 600 that have died from injuries that were kind of related to it, but, weren't directly at that time.
Wow. So the USS Forrestal is an aircraft carrier ship, and they were actually preparing to head to the North Vietnam area. And then unfortunately this tragic event happened, and we don't have to go into detail. We can read it in history, but somehow one of the rockets underneath one of those planes was ignited and fired off and hit another airplane on deck. And my understanding is that then 400 gallons of jet fuel was poured out, and then this horrific fire started.
Yes.
Now, where was your father when all this occurred?
Well, he was actually underneath where it happened, where all that hot fuel was pouring down, but God had him in a little spot where he was protected. He said if he'd been a foot or so over either way, he would have been killed, but he survived. And it's kind of funny because, I didn't even know this part of the story. I mean, I just knew he was on the fire, but it was more recently that they were talking about when he came home, and he was telling my mother about it. And she said, well, obviously God meant, he had a reason for you to live. And so they have pretty much spent their whole life, with the idea of making his life count, because God had a purpose for him surviving.
So your father, was he asleep at the time then, or was he actually?
No.
Okay.
No, he was actually at work. He was doing communications, something with the radios. I'm not sure exactly what it was.
And here's the terrible noise and the alarms, and then what was his role next?
He helped. He and some other guys, they were actually taking those giant bombs and throwing them over the edge so that they wouldn't ignite, which was hard enough. But then he and a friend of his ended up having to go and identify bodies. And that was, for him, he's like, that wasn't for me. I'm not supposed to do that kind of thing. So that was the really horrific part for him, was having to see the burnt bodies.
Sure. And how old would he have been?
He was in his early 20s.
Early 20s, and you're wanting to do something for your country, and you just don't expect this to happen. You in the back of your mind, that bad things could happen, but you don't think of it happening this way, which is so much the way life is.
Well, that's, so many of the people, the guys, they went into the Navy to be on the carriers because that was considered the safe place to be in a war.
Mm-hmm. And now, Senator McCain was actually on the ship at that time, and my understanding is he was actually in one of the planes that they were preparing to sail.
He was the first plane, yes.
Right, and then of course his plane was not struck, but he was able to get to safety. So, how many men approximately were on this ship?
It was around 5,000.
Around 5,000. You have made a movie, as we talked about before, and it's called The Summer of '67, and that can be found at summerof67.com. So that's summerof67.com. Can you tell us a little bit about that site?
It is our, official movie site. And it has all about the movie. It has the trailer. It has endorsements from ministry folks, veterans, different authors, musical artists. We have all the news articles, videos, interviews that we've done related to it, our film festival schedule and accolades and awards, and how to schedule a screening at your church or location.
Great, and I know it's been in a few theaters, and then it's been shown at festivals, and then churches throughout the country are starting to show this film.
Mm-hmm.
How's the reaction been from people that you have come across that were actually on this ship or were living this firsthand?
It's been, I always thought growing up, I just thought it was this obscure piece of history, like I knew it happened to my daddy, but I didn't realize that, I don't know, I guess I just didn't realize how many people were involved in it, but God has just really brought them to us. First off, one of the actors, a local actor here in Nashville, he was on the Forrestal during the fire. And we already knew him, but as soon as he saw the casting notice, he's like, I've been waiting for somebody to do a movie about this. So we have him in the movie. Oh, wow. And, he was just like, somebody needed to tell this story. And then last week we were at a church with a pastor who was on the Forrestal during the fire. He got saved during the fire. He had been fighting God for a long time, and he had a guy who had been witnessing to him, a lieutenant that was always carrying around a Bible and was always praying for him, and he happened to be with that lieutenant in the fire, and the lieutenant's body, he was hit by shrapnel during one of the explosions, and he landed on this pastor. And as a result of that whole experience, he was saved and then committed his life into ministry and has been a preacher ever since. So it was really cool getting to show the movie to his church. And he and his wife both said, they're like, you got it. This is what it's like. His friend that was also on it, and he got to see it. And that's been pretty much all the people who lived through the Vietnam War have said, this is it. Now, the younger people, they'll say you didn't get it right because they know Hollywood's version of the 60s, and we show the small town version of the 60s. It's completely different.
And how was that? What's the main differences there of the Hollywood?
Well, when everybody thinks of the 60s, they think of, all the hippies, the wild living and everything. And we went to our city to use one of the parks to film the hippie hangout, because we do have the hippies, because that was a part of it. And the look on his face, when we're saying we want to film there, and then we're like, it's a faith-based. Oh, okay. And so, there's so many people that they think that that's all the hippie, that that's all the 60s were, was this wild party. And in reality, it was way more serious. It was a lot more, perhaps like the Andy Griffith Show, or more that kind of life for a large portion of our country.
Wow. At what point in your life did your father begin to unfold this story for you? And was it difficult for him? I mean, obviously it was difficult for him to talk about it, but how did those conversations start, and what was that like for you to learn that your father is a hero.
Well, growing up, I honestly, I didn't really think much of it. I knew that he had nightmares at night when I was growing up, like with fire, where he would wake up screaming about fire. And I knew that at some point we were going to build a house in Destin, Florida, which is was a very tiny town. But when we were getting ready to build, somehow we cleared the lot. They were working on the blueprints, and he discovered that the house was in the flight path of the airport, and he wouldn't. He's like, I can't do it. I just can't be there. And so that was kind of the first time that I realized, I guess, kind of the effect that it had. And then when the soldiers were coming back from Afghanistan, whenever that first wave of there was a lot of patriotism and people were making a big fuss. And I remember my mother got really angry. And she's like, this just, it wasn't like that with your daddy. They treated them horribly. She just got so angry. And at first I was thinking that she was talking about how they were treating the soldiers of Afghanistan. But no, it was bringing back all those horrible memories of because it wasn't just the Forrestal, it was having to go through that and then coming back and being treated really poorly. And so that was kind of when I guess I began to realize, something had happened. And I'd kind of heard the story, but I didn't really think about it, honestly, until our daughter was doing some kind of project and she interviewed him. And then I started to really, I guess, as an adult, as a child and as a teenager, I really didn't grasp the significance of it. But as an adult, I began to realize, this was pretty bad. And also the fact that, and I began thinking of like, what would my life have been like if my dad had not been one of the survivors? And what was it like for my mother? Because they heard the news and it was 3 days before anybody found word as to whether or not their men were alive or dead. And so, I just can't imagine that, you see the pictures on TV, you see all that horrific fire and you don't know anything.
Sure. I want to talk about the special viewpoint or angle that you do tell that needs to be told in your movie in just a moment. Before I get to that, though, did your father or mother talk about some of the ways that they were treated, like any certain incidents, or just the way the public treated them when they came back home? I mean, are there any certain things that you mentioned, or just in general that we were not treated
Well, they talked about like spitting on the soldiers. I don't know for certain that Daddy was spit on, but he, witnessed it. It was mostly just not treated with respect. Like they were blamed for things that were beyond their control.
Right. If you're just joining us, this is Pastor Tom, and this is the 24 Today podcast, and you can find out more about me, read my blog, or listen to other podcasts at 24today.org. That's 24today.org, and it's my privilege to have Sharon Wilharm with me today, and she's talking about a movie that her and her husband have made entitled Summer of '67, which has a very heartfelt connection to her personally. And you can find out more about this movie at summerof67.com. That's summerof67.com. You can also connect with Sharon on Facebook and Twitter. Sharon, is your last name spelled Wilharm?
Yes.
Okay, Sharon Wilharm, and you can search her on Google. Also, and you can contact her at any one of these sites. That if you have questions, or if you are a pastor or you're an organization that would love to show a movie that talks about history that we need to remember, then you can contact her in those ways. Sharon, the perspective that you take, which I find is real interesting, is you show this film or tell this story through the eyes of the women of the soldiers, the wives of the soldiers who were left behind through this tragedy. And so tell me a little bit more about that. Why did you choose that particular angle, and why was that special for you?
Well, there's obviously the film world is dominated by men and men's stories. And so, as a female filmmaker, I think it's important to share female stories. Not that men can't enjoy them, but it's just a different perspective. And to my knowledge, there has not been another like war movie about the Vietnam War that is from the home front. It's always told, and the problem with that especially is that veterans don't always want to see the battles. They've got all these horrible memories and, that they try to suppress, and they don't necessarily need to see all that. And I know that I would want to film it. So I try to show it from a softer perspective. And, I like to tell ensemble stories so that we can see the same story told from different perspectives. And so we see how three different women it's three different women whose young men go. One is a husband, one is a brand new husband, one is a boyfriend, and then also the mother of one of the young men. And so we get to see how each one of them deals with the war, and they each respond differently.
Right. And the men obviously have sacrificed, but I agree the families of those that are waiting for their loved ones to return and have limited information, and how their minds must go in terrible directions, wondering what's happening, and that is an altogether different but important sacrifice to remember, and they are heroes in their own way for giving up their loved ones in this way.
Exactly. We were at a screening a couple of weeks ago, and I had a woman who was a military wife sitting behind me. And there's one scene that we have, it's the sock throwing scene. It's just kind of like where he's packing to go away. And 1 minute they're all serious and she's, all scared. And then they're throwing socks and just having this playful moment. And then it's like she remembers again and she gets serious. And the woman behind me, she tapped me and she's like, that's exactly what it's like being a military wife. 1 minute, everything, you forget about it and then you remember. And so I tried to capture, it is hard because if you're raising children without your husband and not knowing if he's going to come back.
Right. Did you mention 3 days earlier, that it was 3 days till they knew, or am I misremembering that?
No, it was 3 days, and it's been interesting because every single person that I've heard from, they all said that's how long the guy. Now, my mother, she found out from a Red Cross woman who came to her door to let her know that he was alive. One of the pastor at the screening last week, he said that he waited in line for 8 hours to use a payphone, and he was able to call, like his wife didn't have a phone, but he was able to call a family member and then passed on, to the other, his friend's family. So, but it was 3 days before anybody, I guess it was 3 days before they got to where the phone was or where they got to where they could communicate.
Does your mom talk about that moment when she found out? I mean, that conversation with the Red Cross representative coming and talking to her. Have you really had that conversation with her of what that must have been like?
We actually haven't. I guess at that point she was just so excited. She's talked more about the waiting and the way that they were treated. But obviously, I'm sure she was overjoyed.
Right. I can't imagine it. Mm-mm. So now, I know that there were a lot of struggles in filming this, and when you're doing big things like this, that sometimes there's obstacles, but you had really huge obstacles in filming this movie.
We did. We knew when we were making a movie, when I was writing the script, and it's a script where it's about that God will be with you through whatever comes your way. We knew there was no way we were going to do a movie like that and not have some kind of struggles. We didn't know what it was going to be. In our case, it ended up being primarily the cast and crew. The biggest thing being that, well, first off, we prayed over every single cast member. We take it very seriously who we cast. We had before we cast any speaking part, we had to be unanimous with my husband and I. Our daughter and her husband had to all agree that that was the best person for that part. And so by the time we had our cast, we knew this was who God wanted. With that being said, 3 weeks before we started to film, I got an email from our lead actress, who was a young newlywed, like 25 years old, saying she had just been diagnosed with breast cancer and had to have immediate surgery. And but she also said, but I've told the doctors that they're going to have to work the surgery around my filming schedule because I am doing this movie.
Wow. Wow.
And so, it was kind of scary because it's like she's in almost every scene. And, if something happened, what do you do? Do you have to, she wasn't able to continue filming, but we're like, no, God has this and we're just going to work on schedule. So she had her surgery 8 days before showing up on set. Oh my. And she didn't want a big fuss made over her. And so she only wanted the people who needed to know. And so the cast members or the crew members that were, we had kind of taken care of her because she couldn't lift her arms, she couldn't hold anything, and obviously she was very weak. But we all worked around it, and it was just a really special time when we prayed over her. She knew that we have a prayer team of 100 folks that I had created the group back when I was writing the script. And so all along we had them praying for each thing that came up. And so she knew that she had those 100 folks that were really praying for her. And I think it really made a difference. It was kind of cool because the girl that played her sister, they literally bonded like sisters. And so Bethany would pick up Rachel because Rachel couldn't drive. And so she would pick her up and they would, have that time. And when we were having breaks or whatever, you would see Rachel lying on the couch, trying to get some energy, but you would never know. She gave it her all. And I'm sure it gave it a dimension to her acting, having dealt with that. But, and then we had 2 of our actors, our supporting actors, who both have MS. The dad, who he wasn't actually an actor, he was just a friend of ours that has MS, and he plays the dad who's always in the wheelchair. And we really wanted somebody that was disabled to play that role. But he had his limitations, like he couldn't use like his right side, like his right arm. And then the woman who played his sister, who was the aunt, her MS isn't quite as obvious, but like she couldn't do like from her left. And so we have this toddler that's in the scenes. And so a lot of times it's like, okay, Rachel can't hold her. These 2 can't. Who's going to hold Tommy? So we had to be creative, but God saw us through it all.
This starts off as you wanting to tell a story, but at some point it must become a mission for you. Like, I've got to tell this story. And I'm sure that's how it was for you and your husband, and it still is. And then also for the actors and actresses.
Honestly, we do see filmmaking as a ministry, and I also think that it's just as important, the filming aspects of it, not just where God takes it when it's finished, because we have no guarantees that it's ever going to go anywhere. When you're making a movie, you don't know what's going to happen, but I can control the filming, and so I feel it's very important that we cast people that I feel really need that experience, who are going to benefit from it, and that God puts together just the right cast and crew that really strengthen each other. We pray throughout the day, every day. It's interesting because a lot of times, we start off the day in prayer, but throughout the times as people were going through different things, you'd look and there would be, 2 cast members praying or a crew member. There was witnessing going on to some, throughout. There was one of the actresses was like kind of mentoring some of the younger ones. And so it really is a spiritual experience when we're filming.
Without giving the movie story away, how does faith come into the story as you're telling it?
Well, each of the girls has to, deal with their faith, with what's going to happen. The two sisters, their big thing is that at the beginning of the movie, we see when they're young, their dad was in the Korean War and came back in a wheelchair, and the mom couldn't handle it, so she kills herself, and that's at the very beginning. And so the girls, their whole life are kind of dealing with that of mom couldn't handle, bad things. Am I going to be able to handle bad things? And it was interesting because one of the actresses actually researched on what happens to children whose parents commit suicide. And it was very interesting statistics based on how young the children were and all that. And then we have Ruby May, who is the family's maid, and her young man is missing in action, but she has the faith. She's the strong one that helps kind of guide them.
Did your father, your mother, or you ever struggle with the why me? Why did this happen to me? Are there regrets that your father has? I wish I would have never, signed up. Or what are there struggles like that you go through?
Well, I've been very, very blessed, and so I have no business whatsoever with that attitude. Honestly, I haven't. I know it was very tough for my dad. He's a very sensitive soul, and so having to see that was very difficult for him. He doesn't like, obviously to see suffering and all that. But no, pretty much theirs is that, we have a purpose in life. And so we've been blessed by God, and we need to serve him.
And so somehow God used all of that to make them the person that they are today, and somehow they would probably say, I wouldn't have changed. I still would go through it, right? That's a hard thing.
Yeah,
really
it is, yeah. And now, of course, with the pastor that was saved, he was definitely, as horrific as it was, he was like, that's what it took for God to get his attention.
Well, Sharon, I want to thank you for making a difference with your life. And I can't imagine the faith that it must take at times to have these huge expenditures of money to make films like this, and you're kind of like a farmer. You don't know what the harvest is going to be, and you've had to struggle, I'm sure, with God's will, and it'd be a whole lot easier to be doing something else, but yet this is how God has called you and your husband in your life, and so you're choosing to trust him and make a difference.
Well, thank you. One thing that's been kind of interesting is that when we wrote this movie, we wanted it to be something that would not just speak to the church, but could be such that anybody watching it could see how we need faith and how God is there for us. But, as Christians, a lot of times it's very hard to speak so that the world can understand, because we tend to write and to present for Christians. But it's been really cool that he has done that, especially in the way of secular film festivals. We have been in a number of secular film festivals and have a couple coming up, including one that's in LA that we have no idea why they picked our movie, because it is nothing like their other movies. But it's actually the second LA Film Festival that's been interested and liked it. And so it's really cool that the same movie that can speak to a church full of spiritual giants can also speak to a very, very unspiritual audience as well.
Sure. Sharon, as I close our interview today, let me just ask you, what are some things that the world needs to know, needs to remember about this tragedy or the people that were involved? Are there some big picture things that we're missing and should just think about in today's world?
Well, the reason that I originally wanted to write a movie that took place in the 60s was because, I wrote it several years ago because there's a long process that it takes. But at the time, there were just so much turmoil, protest, feeling like God has left America, like, like we have just turned. And it's so easy to wonder what's going to happen to our world, just to get so depressed. But I wanted to show that our country has gone through turmoil and difficult times before. There are so many similarities between the 60s and now, and that God was there then, and he was there with the people and saw them through all that turbulence, and he will be with us now. And, this didn't catch him by surprise either time period.
Sure.
He is the God of all times.
Sharon, thank you for being my guest today. And again, her movie is The Summer of '67. It's one of, this is now the 7th film that she has made, and her and her husband. And you can find out more about that at summerof67.com, summerof67.com. And you can check out Sharon at sharonwilharm.com. And you can find her on Facebook and Twitter. Just Google her name and you can contact her and find out more. I'm very anxious to see the movie myself. Is it at this point, it's the best way to see it in a church? I'm a pastor, to have it at my own church, or what are some ways that we can see this movie?
Well, we signed last week with a distributor, so it will be getting out there, but it's going to be, a little bit before that. Honestly, I feel like with this movie, we found it's best to see it, kind of in person than just on TV. I feel like it's kind of cool to see it with a group, because then everybody starts talking. And that's been a really special thing, is just seeing the conversations that come from it as different generations start sharing. If pastors would like to show it at their church, we do have a form on our website. And obviously, as a pastor, you're not going to want to show a movie that you've not seen already. And so if they fill out the form and let us know, hey, I've not seen it, but I think this would be good for our church. Can I see a screener? We will send them a private screener link.
Great.
So you can watch it ahead of time before you commit to it. You're filling out the form, but you're not committing to show it until you've seen it.
I assume it's the kind of movie that then is good to invite your friends who perhaps don't have a faith in God, or would love to see this history, and then they could also hear what faith means to them.
Exactly. That's what we're trying. And a lot of churches have been doing like a meal and a movie, like a potluck, or one church is doing a fish fry, because then that makes it a good outreach activity. Good.
Well, I want to thank everyone again for listening to the 24 Today podcast. And again, this is Pastor Tom, and you can check me out at 24today.org. That's 24today.org. And if you like this podcast, just click like, if you will, and share it. That'd be even better. And you can also subscribe to the YouTube channel that you find this on. So thanks again, Sharon.